Hello, historians. Today we are going to be talking about Europe after the fall of Rome. So, Lesson 1 in the reading covers geography of Northern and Southern Europe and the impact that that geography has had on history in the time period we're talking about. Then we'll talk a little bit about the spread of Christianity in Europe and a bit as well about the Frankish kingdoms and the important leader Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Now, that's a lot to get through in one lesson, and so necessarily we're not going to go too deep into any one of the areas, so keep an eye out for future readings or other material that delves a little bit deeper into each of these sections as we move forward. So, Europe after the fall of Rome. Now, the geography of Europe was very much the same both before and after the Roman Empire. The geography didn't change very much, but the geography can help us understand exactly why the political situation in Europe played out the way it did after the collapse of the empire. So, while we don't have time for a brief history of Rome or anything like that, I'll just say that the most notable and important thing about the Roman Empire relevant to what we're discussing in the Middle Ages is simply that it, compared to Middle Age society in Europe, was very centralized, right? So by the time the empire was at its height, you had an emperor who was more or less in full control. You had governors who were in centralized control of large areas. They commanded legions or the Roman army, which enforced the rules and laws of the Roman Empire. So the same overall political system was responsible for keeping law and order as the way of life everywhere around the Mediterranean. So we could look at some of our maps of the Roman Empire. We see from Spain to the Middle East, the entire Mediterranean coast and much beyond was all ostensibly under this type of Roman law. Now, that's not to say everything was exactly the same everywhere in the Roman Empire. In fact, one of the reasons why the Roman Empire was successful was that it incorporated regional differences and didn't try to make everybody conform exactly to the Roman way of life, but at the end of the day, they had a common source of law and a common source of authority. And this more or less vanished when the Roman Empire collapsed. So, to say that the whole thing collapsed is of course wrong. The Western and Eastern empires had split by this point, and the Eastern Roman Empire remained going strong for another 500 years, and going, in at least some capacity, for 1,000 years after the fall of the West. We know it primarily as the Byzantine Empire today, but they would have continued to call themselves Romans through this time period. However, the western half of the empire certainly collapsed politically, right? This doesn't mean every single thing that the Romans built suddenly turned to ruins or disappeared, but it does mean that there wasn't that centralized authority anymore. No one person giving laws, no one army enforcing those laws, no one culture that's sort of seen as the most prominent or important. Now, the memory of Rome would continue to live on for many generations, and even until today, we look at the Roman Empire with a great deal of respect. Just look at the way that America copies the architectural style of Rome for important buildings like courthouses and our own Capitol building, all built in the Roman style. And we've even named our legislative branch, our highest legislative branch, the Senate, directly after the Senate of ancient Rome. So clearly the memory of Rome is important even until today. So it continues to be important throughout medieval Europe, throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. However, politically, it's not there anymore. It's just a thought. It's a memory. It was a way of doing things, but there's no longer that centralized authority. And so we get to see what happens to essentially an entire continent when it loses its government more or less overnight. But before we really get too deep into that, we should talk about the geography of Europe overall. Right? So although we call Europe a continent, we can see that it's actually part of Eurasia, a large landmass that includes both Europe and Asia. The Ural Mountains in modern Russia are usually considered the border between the two. But it's entirely political that we call Europe its own separate continent. In terms of geography, it could be one landmass, and we don't need to get into all of that. But the idea that Europe is something that is separate and different from Asia is actually a really important political point, but not necessarily an important geographical point. But if we look at a map of Europe, there are a few in your books, or some have been posted to the course as well. You can see that Europe's geography varies pretty wildly from place to place. It's a place with a lot of different climates and a lot of different types of geography. So, for example, it's a very mountainous region overall, but it's broken up into many smaller mountain ranges. So there's mountain ranges that cover most of southern Europe, but in the north you'll find mostly plains. So the vast Northern European plain, located throughout Northern Europe, is the location of most of Europe's rivers. Most of them begin up in these mountains a bit to the south and then flow north to the sea. If you go even further from the Northern European plain, the land does start to rise again, and we get new sets of hills and mountains going all the way up to Scandinavia. So overall, the European coastline is a lot longer than it should be given the size of Europe, right? The coastline is longer than it seems like it should be because it's actually very jagged. There are a lot of peninsulas, and when you have a little peninsula sticking out into the sea, you're increasing the amount of coast by actually a large amount. And so Europe is chock full of peninsulas and other jagged landforms kind of jutting out into the sea, and as such, much more of the European land is exposed to the coast. More of it is coastal than in a lot of other regions, right? So if you look at a map of Europe, you look at the many islands and archipelagos and fjords, especially along the coast of, say, Scandinavian countries, along the northern coasts of the United Kingdom or Northern Europe, even around Denmark and everything, you'll see a large number of peninsulas and islands and other things that add to the total coastline, right? And this is important because it's part of the reason why Europeans, especially Southern Europeans who have the relatively calm Mediterranean Sea exposure, become pretty adept pretty quickly comparatively at sailing in large bodies of water. Sailing technology is going to play a huge part in European history, starting during this very lesson. So Europe's climate and vegetation, much like its actual physical geography, varies widely as well. Southern Europe is largely warm and sunny even during the winter. Shrubs and trees don't need a lot of water there. They're used to growing with somewhat less rainfall. It's a little bit drier, a little bit warmer. Whereas most of northwestern Europe is milder and cooler with much more precipitation, so it's a wetter climate overall, mostly due to the North Atlantic Drift, which is an ocean current that brings warm water up to northwestern Europe, although winds going in the same direction bring freezing weather as well. But it's one of the reasons why someplace like England or the United Kingdom more generally has actually much milder, warmer weather than we would expect for something of that longitude because of this sort of ocean effect. There's major differences as well between Southern Europe and Northern Europe in the way that geography has affected communities that develop. So in Southern Europe, like we already said, there's plenty of exposure to the Mediterranean Sea, which is a largely calm compared to the Atlantic Ocean place where you can sail. Crops like grapes and olives became very important in Southern Europe and around the Mediterranean generally, because those are examples of plants that can grow in rugged landscapes and with less water than some other crops. So things like grapes and olives really thrived in the area, and so it's no surprise that Southern European food incorporates those things quite a lot. Northern Europe, on the other hand, had access to the sea, but the North Sea and the Northern Atlantic Sea being much rougher places to sail, it wasn't as vital to the economy of the areas until sailing technology improved a bit with the Vikings, as we'll see a bit later on. So Northern Europeans, though, still had plenty of access to water-based trade because Northern Europe is where the majority of European rivers are. So rivers across the entire Northern European plain were very important because not only did they provide access to the sea for people who built towns along these rivers, you could follow the river then to the ocean, but also the rivers brought water down from the mountains to irrigate the land that made up this plain. So the Northern European plain is important because it's a large area of flat farmland, so it's easy to do agriculture there, and the rivers bring water down from the mountains as well. So we'll notice that most of the important cities that we think of in Europe are built along one of these major rivers. So Paris, for example, was actually originally built an island in the middle of the river that runs through it. London as well is built along the Thames River. Pretty much every important European city that stretches back to this time period needed to have some level of river access, especially if it isn't right on the coast. Because cities were more able to develop large agricultural bases in Northern Europe because of the topography, the excellent farmland made kind of an easy route as well for invaders to follow. So invaders is a little bit of a politically loaded term, but for people anyway, right? People did not emigrate into Southern Europe quite as much coming from other places to the east in Asia because it was incredibly mountainous, very difficult to actually traverse. So people who were entering Europe tended to enter Northern Europe. When we see the fall of the Western Empire, this is largely because people who lived in Northern Europe were displaced from new arrivals from the east, and so they moved southwest further into the empire, kind of came into conflict with the more politically dominant forces. But either way, the north being relatively flat made it both easy to succeed there, but also a more tempting place for new peoples to inhabit. And we'll talk more about that as we go. Before we talk too much about the politics of how European countries or kingdoms developed, let's talk about religion quickly. So, by the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Roman Empire had largely moved on from its traditional pantheon of gods and goddesses. That is to say, if you're familiar with Greek or Roman mythology, the entire pantheon of different goddesses, whether you want to call Zeus Jupiter or Jupiter Zeus, either way, had kind of fallen by the wayside. So this wasn't an overnight process. It actually took a very long time. But eventually the traditional ancient religion of the Roman people faded away as Christianity spread. So Christianity began as a pretty small religion in the Middle East, began really as a offshoot of Judaism. But one of the important distinctions is that Christianity is evangelical, which means that it wants to spread. Christians want to convert other people to Christianity, which is not true of something like Judaism. So the Roman Empire kind of grudgingly tolerated Judaism for a long time, with various rebellions and various Jewish colonies breaking away or rejoining at different times. But ultimately, it wasn't too much of a problem because the religion didn't really want to spread at all. Jewish people thought, we're the Jewish people and we're the ones who practice this religion. It's not for other people. So they didn't actively try to spread it around. Early Christianity, though, took a different tact entirely. So early Christianity spread throughout the Middle East relatively quickly, and as it gained notoriety within the empire, at certain points it was discouraged, at certain points Christians were actively persecuted by the emperors, especially if the emperors wanted to promote traditional Roman values like the ancient gods and goddesses that they had been worshipping for many hundreds of years. But eventually, with Emperor Constantine, the empire actually converted the official state religion to Christianity. So after the reign of Constantine, the Roman Empire no longer practiced traditional Roman religion, but was instead a Christian empire. Now, there's many, many books written about the impact of Christianity on the Roman Empire, the interplay between the political forces like the emperor and the religious forces like the bishops and pope, and we can go into that in a lot of detail. But for our purposes right now, we're just going to look at it as Christianity was the official religion of the empire, and though the empire fell, the religion certainly did not, right? So the Romans' religion of Christianity, by the time the empire fell, outlived the actual empire itself and continued to grow and gain strength for really many hundreds of years after that. However, Christianity was not too popular in Northern Europe, as the empire didn't really spread too far to the north. It was very much a Mediterranean empire, and so there were still plenty of pagan people. So, for instance, people who lived way up in the north in Scandinavia, who we might call Vikings now, did indeed convert to Christianity after a certain point, but there was also a long period of time where they still believed in their traditional pantheon of gods and goddesses, Thor and Odin and all of that, while most of Europe was slowly converting to Christianity. But eventually the Vikings got there as well. So how did Christianity spread from the southern political base of the empire to the north? There's usually a couple of different ways that we want to talk about. So largely, it was spread, not by accident. It was very purposeful in the way that Christianity spread through Europe and very intentionally done. So missionaries are perhaps the most powerful force that helped to spread Christianity into Northern Europe. So the Pope, who was the head, or is the head of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church specifically, would send missionaries to different places where Christianity was not as popular. So the Pope, who's the head of the church, would send missionaries out to people in the northern kingdoms to teach about Christianity. They would try to convert people to a particular religion. Some missionaries traveled great distances. So some traveled from Rome all the way to Britain, which would have been a massive trip at the time. They traveled all over the different islands of Britain, what would be England and Ireland, all the way up to Scotland. Other missionaries carried Christianity into northern France and Germany and into the east as well. Not all missionaries, though, were sent by the Pope. Some Christians took it upon themselves to spread what they would call the Word of God. And one of these important missionaries was Patrick, who took it upon himself to travel to Britain and Ireland and convert people there. This is important even today, as he's been canonized as Saint Patrick and is a very important figure in the history of those areas. So while missionaries traveled to spread Christian teachings, men called monks were dedicated to their faith in a different way. So kind of in the opposite way, really. Monks were religious men who lived apart from the rest of society in isolated communities. Monks and their monasteries are actually like a really fascinating topic that I would love to be able to talk about more right now. The classic ideas we have of monks kind of hide the really interesting history behind the development of the monastic orders. And so perhaps we'll get into that a little bit more on a separate occasion. But what you need to know for now is that monks would live in communities that were called monasteries. Sometimes these were buildings or campuses of a few buildings, often very isolated from other places, up in the mountains or otherwise away from major cities, although cities would tend to sprout up around them if they were particularly large monasteries. But either way, in these communities, monks spent their time in prayer, in meditation, and in very simple work that allowed them to really focus on their religion. So life in a monastery was strictly organized, and different monasteries, different monastic orders worked in different ways, but generally monks had to follow certain rules that were intended to help them live a good life according to their religion. So their day-to-day affairs were very much based around this. The most famous of the monasteries was probably one created by a monk named Benedict, who founded the Benedictine order, or the Benedictine rule. This was sort of a standard set of practices for monasteries and ended up being one of the more popular sets for monasteries to follow. If you think of just a monk generally today, you're probably thinking of a Benedictine monk. Different groups had their own rules. However, all were based around generally the idea of living apart from society, being removed from all of the things in society that could distract you from being a good person according to your religion. So monks performed many different services, both inside and outside monasteries. They had to, survive somehow, and so while they grew food and all of this stuff, they still needed a way to be integrated into the communities more generally, because a monastery couldn't be totally self-sufficient. So monasteries would provide services. They would provide things like health care that was unavailable to many poorer members of most communities, or they would provide religious services. They might dispense aid to the poor, right? So they would give out food to people who couldn't afford food of their own. And practicing this charity was an important part of living a good life. Sometimes they also performed services that they could sell for money. So, for example, some monasteries became specialized in sewing clothing or in writing manuscripts, which we'll get into more later, that they can then sell and then use the money to run the monastery. But ultimately, some of them ended up being rather successful in what they were selling, because they did work on it all day, isolated from the rest of the world, so they became actually pretty skilled at their crafts, in addition to living a very religiously focused life. So they ran schools, they copied books for those who couldn't read or write. They also copied books just to keep them around. The material that they used to make books at the time did not last forever. They might fade away or disintegrate within somebody's lifetime even. And so monks would copy over books to new material every so often to keep the books fresh. And this is kind of like a never-ending process until we invented the printing press. But it was very vital. And without monks doing that, we probably would have lost a lot of the most important texts of the time periods. They would also serve as scribes and advisors to local rulers. Often they were the only ones in an area that could read and write. That was something that was pretty much tied to religious learning. You had to learn to read and write through church-associated schools. Most people didn't know how, frankly, because you didn't need to be a farmer or whatever the case is. So rulers, even though they were in charge, they might not be able to actually read and write themselves, and so they also always kept monks around in order to do some of those things, right? So as religion spread from southern to northern Europe, and religiously it became more unified, politically things were going in a different direction. So after the Roman Empire fell, various groups all basically had to compete for authority in different areas, right? So essentially, when you remove the main authority, when you remove the centralized authority of the Roman Empire, who's in charge? And the answer tended to be whoever was most powerful in a given area, right? So different regional governors or warlords or soldiers who happened to have a big following, or maybe merchants who were able to pay enough people to fight for them. Whoever happened to be most powerful in an area was more or less in charge of that area by default. If there was somebody nearby who was kind of like equally powerful, you might just continue to exist side by side. But if there was a conflict, it would be very dangerous to either organization, right? If you fought a conflict with another regional neighbor, even if you won, you might be now weak enough that somebody else would conquer you. So there was a very fine balance in how militaristic these rulers wanted to be. They wanted to be militaristic enough to defend and expand their areas, but they also did not want to be so aggressive as to have to fight too many wars and then weaken themselves such that they might be conquered in turn. So what you ended up with was often people making arrangements, and this leads to the creation of feudalism, which we'll talk about later on. But essentially, what used to be one empire was now many hundreds or perhaps even thousands of small political entities that were all a little bit paranoid about what all of the other ones were up to. So these many, many small kingdoms existed throughout Europe, and even though religion was becoming more centralized, the actual political borders were becoming less centralized. However, as we can tell from the simple fact that Europe is not made of thousands of different countries today, that this situation wouldn't last forever, and groups would slowly unite or at least pledge loyalty to each other in ever-increasing political units until we have things that are more resembling countries. But this was not an easy or short process. It happened very gradually, and there were a lot of ups and downs in terms of decentralization and re-centralization. But the most important group that we want to look at right now are the Franks. And so it's tempting to think of the Franks as simply the early French, and to some extent that is accurate, but we don't want to have the misunderstanding that they were actually just like French people from a long time ago, right? They didn't really speak French, or at least very few of them spoke French. French was really just the language of the area immediately around Paris. Is originally a dialect of Latin, but either way, the Franks were, some would call them a tribe, some might call them large kinship structure, some would call them, an early version of a country, but they didn't have, set borders and other things that we would necessarily expect from a modern country, but definitely a larger political unit. Either way, the Franks are one of the Germanic tribes that we want to talk about. So they're from the region of Gaul, which was mostly contiguous with modern-day France, but the Romans would have known it as Gaul. They conquered it relatively early on in the span of Roman history, and so there was a lot of residual influence from the Roman Empire, certainly still in the area. Now, all of the different tribes throughout the regions where the Franks settled would often be in conflict with each other. During this time, most of the different tribes or most of the different groups of Franks weren't necessarily Christian at all. They all followed different pagan religions, some a little bit more Scandinavian, some a little bit more in line with what was being followed in Celtic areas. But either way, it was Clovis, who was a king of the Franks, who first converted to Christianity, or rather was the first major ruler to convert to Christianity, right? So he was able to consolidate a lot of power, and then once Clovis's kingdom reached a certain size, he converted himself and his small empire into Christianity, which was important because then it received the backing and the authority of the Pope, right? So when you have a king, when you have a ruler who is calling themselves a Christian now, suddenly it becomes even more attractive for other lesser nobility or even common people to identify as Christian as well, because then you might be in the good graces of this powerful ruler who is Christian and therefore supposed to take care of other Christians in the world, right? So converting to Christianity was also seen as a way of being closer to rulers who had done the same, and rulers kind of had the same advantage, right? If they declared themselves Christian, and a lot of people in the area were, they would be less likely to have to fight to control the area if they showed that they were similar to the people that they wanted to rule. If they had the same beliefs in religion, maybe people will be more accepting of this person being king, right? So both sides really had something to gain by consolidating religiously in this way. So Clovis converted to Christianity and thereby grew his power even more. So more and more Franks wanted to join Clovis. But it was Clovis's descendant Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who truly united the Franks into one political entity. So Charlemagne was a great warrior. He built up his strength really mostly by conquering surrounding kingdoms until his own kingdom became big enough that other people didn't really want to fight all that much, and so he was able to incorporate more area politically, having people pay homage to him or pay tribute to him rather than actually having to fight. But either way, Charlemagne was able to unite the Franks and built an empire that spans most of modern France and a good bit of modern Germany. So Charlemagne ended up spending a lot of his time at war because he was very much a conquering king. He personally led his armies into most battles that he fought against neighboring kingdoms, and so that was another way that he had a lot of respect from his people. And by the time he was finished, Charlemagne's empire really included pretty much all of what is now France, but like we said, also parts of modern Germany, but also parts of modern Austria and Italy, and even sections of northern Spain. So, where Charlemagne really stands out, though, because this empire could have easily completely fallen apart as soon as he died, and part of the way that it didn't was by his real uniting the politics of the empire with this new religion of Christianity. So we don't have time to get into like all of the details on how this went down, but probably the most historically important part of Charlemagne's rule was that he went from being king of the Franks to the Holy Roman Emperor. So how did that happen? Charlemagne, as a Christian king, had conquered many parts of the former Roman Empire, right? So he conquered all of Gaul, he conquered parts of Italy and Spain like we talked about. So he was already politically in charge of a lot of the area that used to be the Roman Empire. So he's a very important player to people in Rome, and that includes the Pope. So the Catholic Church is based in Rome, even though Rome is no longer the seat of the great empire it used to be. It is still the seat of Christianity as a religion. And so the Pope in Rome obviously knows who Charlemagne is, that he's an important king, and also an important king who specifies that he wants to be king of a great Christian land, right? And so perhaps this is why the Pope asks Charlemagne for help when various other factions are threatening to essentially invade Rome, right? We don't have time to get into all of the politics, but some of the regional kings in the area of Italy, so we're talking about places like Lombardy, around Milan, and all of these places, they wanted to be in charge of the ancient city of Rome and all of its great treasures and the authority that comes with being in charge of Rome itself as the capital of Christianity. And so the Pope calls upon Charlemagne for aid, and Charlemagne succeeds in fighting off some of the other lesser kings and ends up marching all the way to Rome. So on Christmas Day in the year 800, so very important year, very important day, the Pope crowned Charlemagne the Emperor of the Romans. Now this was meant to symbolize a return to the greatness of the Roman Empire, and while we didn't quite get there, it was very effective, and the Holy Roman Empire, in one form or another, would last for many hundreds of years after this crowning. Stories about exactly how this happened are very varied. Charlemagne himself said that he did not expect the Pope to do this. He was just going to church on Christmas normally, and the Pope decided to crown him emperor. Seems unlikely, but he might want to say that so that he seems more humble, like a ruler should be. But this was really important because it really united these two forces, right? The legitimacy of the Pope being the one to place the crown on his head meant that all Christians, even those not directly in the Charlemagne's kingdom, had to acknowledge or at least contend with the fact that this person was crowned emperor by the very head of the religion themselves. A person who is said to speak for God, the Pope, put a crown on Charlemagne's head. So it becomes much harder to argue all of a sudden for the average person that Charlemagne is not a legitimate ruler, right? So perhaps even more important than conquering places through the military was getting this distinction, getting the crown from the Pope himself, because that cemented him as the not only emperor, but the Christian emperor. And so it became harder for other people to argue. At the same time, this gained for the Pope the protection of Charlemagne, right? Because the Pope is now the source of Charlemagne's spiritual authority, Charlemagne also has an incentive to protect the Pope and keep the Pope relatively happy, right? Charlemagne's not going to conquer Rome himself. Instead, he'll protect Rome, because now Rome is the source of his spiritual authority. So this situation really helps both the Pope in Rome, and it helps Charlemagne and his kingdom as well. So he becomes known as the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire doesn't really include much of the land that used to belong to the Roman Empire. It doesn't really include the rest of the Mediterranean. It's mostly European focused. But compared to all of these little political entities that we had beforehand, this is a huge step up in terms of centralization. Now, realistically, Charlemagne doesn't have complete control over every single area in his empire. He has a lot of lesser lords that are in charge of those areas, but they all pay tribute to him, and they're all, at least allegedly, loyal to him. So part of what made Charlemagne so successful was his skill as a warrior or as a general. That's how he was able to conquer people in the first place. Another thing that made him successful was incorporating Christianity into his rule. So Europeans became more politically united under the empire, and they became more spiritually united under Christianity. So this started to form more of a European identity, which isn't really something that had been seen before. Europeans didn't think of themselves as Europeans. They thought of themselves as Romans, or as Franks, or as Germanic people, right? There was no political cohesion to Europe as a continent. This started to change when Charlemagne conquered so much of the area. But he didn't spend all of his time on these areas, warfare and spirituality. He was also very invested in the idea that cultural development was very important in order to keep his empire together, right? He needed to develop a European culture so that people would see each other as neighbors and equals and allies against people who were not European, who we'll talk about in a bit. So Charlemagne actually really sponsored a lot of education. He built monasteries and schools all across his European kingdom. He brought in scholars to teach at his capital city from all over the known world. He made his capital in an area that's now in Western Germany, but it was really in the center of the empire that he had created. And he brought in scholars from all over the world to his empire to not only develop ideas further, but also spread things like reading and writing. And so Charlemagne also helped to develop the culture of Europe at the same time that he helped to develop the spread of Christianity and the political unification of many parts of Europe. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that all was well. As Europe was coalescing into one political entity, religiously and politically, it also faced a lot of threats from the outside. So your text uses the word invaders a lot, but there's kind of a judgment there. People invading. We could also just call them settlers, or people who are looking for a place that would be a good home, right? A lot of people were displaced from the east, and so they moved into Europe along the European plain that we talked about. And so Europeans had to contend this as well. So there were three main sort of outside groups that were interested in the more central areas of Europe. So let's talk about them pretty quickly. So, because even while Charlemagne was building his empire, there were these new things to contend with all around Europe. So we're just going to talk about them very, very briefly. We'll get into each group more later on. But first we have Islamic empires that are expanding rapidly in the south, right? So it's during this time period, more or less, that Islam develops as a religion in what we would now call the Middle East. It very quickly spreads to incorporate most of the Middle East, to incorporate what Christians would call the Holy Land, incorporate the important city of Jerusalem, but then spread to economically very important areas like Egypt. Egypt had been one of the main sources of wealth of the Roman Empire, but as Islamic empires or caliphates expanded out of the Middle East, Egypt was one of the first to be conquered. So now they had a very strong economic base, and Muslim empires continued to expand across northern Africa all the way to Spain. So people went from the northern tip of what's now like Morocco to Spain and continued to expand in that direction. It wouldn't be until many hundreds of years later that Christian Europeans and Spanish Muslims would actually fight a series of wars that would remove Islamic influence from Spain for the time being, right? But all along the southern borders of Europe, these Islamic empires were gaining strength. Meanwhile, from the east, you have the Magyar people who are entering across this European plain. These are people who were displaced by nomadic people to the east, so essentially they were fleeing nomadic horse cultures. So, it wouldn't be period accurate, but we could think of the Mongols, for example, making certain eastern locations just a little bit harder to live in, and so Magyars would move west into the relatively more protected Europe. The mountainous regions made it harder for these nomadic tribes to interfere with them. So Magyars aren't really a political or ethnic group that we consider super separately from Europeans today, but at the time period they would have been seen as outsiders. Magyars are the ethnic group that settles the region that's now Hungary, and is why there's always some conflict between Hungary and Austria until ultimately they united into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But they're moving into Central Europe. They're settling different areas. Some areas they have friendly relations, some areas are less friendly, but either way, that's from the east. And then in the north, you, of course, have Vikings. So we'll talk more about the Vikings later on, but the Vikings become incredibly skilled at seacraft. They become very good mariners and sailors, and so they are able to sail up many of these northern European rivers so that they can raid areas, or so that they can trade with areas too. Vikings are often, presented as unusually barbaric people, but they really weren't. They were the usual amount of barbaric for the time period, but Europeans were very scared of them because they could show up at any time, right? They might not have been more violent than any random Frankish person, but they could show up a lot more unexpectedly because of their incredible naval technology. It just allowed them to move around much faster. And we'll talk about why this caused coalescing politically in areas of Northern Europe in a bit. But for now, what you need to know is really that Europeans are kind of boxed in between Islamic empires in the south, Magyars and other groups moving in from the east, and the threat of Vikings in the north. A lot of Europeans feel like they need kind of an incentive to really stick together during this time period. And so that could also be a good part of the reason why Charlemagne is successful, right? It's seen as beneficial to have a really strong European ruler to defend against these exterior threats. So, what have we talked about today? We looked quickly at the geography of Europe, why Northern Europe and Southern Europe differ politically up to this time period, and why they're very different geographically. We talked about the spread of Christianity from the old base of the Roman Empire into the more northern areas of Europe, and the adoption of Christianity by Clovis and Charlemagne. We talked about how politically things broke down after the fall of the empire, and warlords or other local notables became in charge of their own respective areas of influence, and there were many hundreds, if not thousands, of small, tiny kingdoms throughout Europe. And then finally, we talked about how Charlemagne began the process of reuniting them into a politically cohesive unit that they called the Holy Roman Empire. So, the Roman Empire, but with the addition of the blessings of the church, shall we say, right? So the Pope Leo III, puts that crown on Charlemagne's head and more or less changes the course of European history in that moment. So that's a lot to take in. All coincides with the reading that was assigned for this unit, and we'll definitely take a more detailed look at some of these things as we move through. But it's your overview for where Europe is when we're getting started, right? At the beginning of the Middle Ages, these are the forces in play. It'll be exciting to see what they get up to over the next 500 years or so. Until then.